Hi, I'm Dr. Sukli Liu, and I'm going to continue on talking about open data and data sharing, specifically for rehabilitation researchers. So hopefully you enjoyed those last two talks. I love the video from Dr. Martone's talk about what it typically looks like when you request data. Hopefully by the new NIH policies, that will not happen anymore. And hopefully after watching these videos, you will make sure that your data is in a format that if somebody asks for it, you can easily share it, and or you already share it through an archive. So this is essentially part two of last week and this week. So last week we talked about how we could use data science and in particular data management techniques to address reproducibility. And this week we're going to talk about how we could use open science to address replicability. So just as a reminder, replicability is essentially if you read a published paper that has 30 subjects and they found X finding, if you then go and recruit a separate 30 subjects and you do the exact same methods as that paper, you should be able to get the exact same finding or something very similar. So there are a lot of things that lead to a lack of replicability. One would be a positive publication bias. So maybe if there's two sets of 30 people, one has a positive result just by chance, and the other has a null result also by chance. The one that has the positive result is going to get published much more easily because it's easier to publish non-null findings. One of the things that can overcome that was discussed last time is pre-registration. So pre-registering your study means that there are some journals where you can say, this is my study background, hypotheses, methods, and design. And they will say, okay, they'll review it and say, we accept this. And then you collect the data. And as long as you follow the protocol, they essentially agree to publish your paper, regardless of if it is null or positive finding. And that's one way that the field is moving towards to get rid of publication biases. However, there's other logistic limitations that affect replicability, including having limited time, money, and participant availability, which leads to sometimes biased and underpowered samples. And that I think is something we have all experienced, myself included, very much. And so the goal of big data and open science is to be able to either utilize existing data or harmonize your data with other data sets or use large existing data sets to be able to make sure that what you're finding and reporting is something that is consistent and generalizable outside of your own sample. So what can be done? There's a lot of different types of data sets and big data sources that are out there. One are retrospective data sets that have been archived. These are usually from single studies. They finish their study and they archive the data so that other people can use it, which is awesome. The second are pooled samples, where you're archiving or harmonizing multiple data sets from diverse research sites. So an example of that is what we do in Enigma, for instance. We take data sets across many sites that have been collected, and we harmonize them so that we end up with one large data set that is really diverse because it was collected under different protocols across different sites with maybe a few similar features so that we can analyze the data. And then finally, there are large prospective data sets. Some examples are the UK Biobank, the Human Connectome project here in the US, as well as the All of Us initiative by the US. So these are going to be really large, really thoughtfully curated data sets with tens to hundreds of thousands of samples in them. And so all of these benefit from you having some data science skills so that you can accurately scrub the data, manage it, and analyze it across sites. But these are some kind of thoughts for how open science will work and help benefit your data. For those who are a little bit unfamiliar with open science, in a nutshell, it's just sharing published and unpublished data, code, protocols, and resources so that other people can learn from what you've gained and build from it. I bolded unpublished because I think this is especially useful. How many of us have collected a data set? It yielded null results. We didn't think we could publish it, and it's just sitting somewhere, maybe wasted, you know? But I think by publishing or at least sharing this unpublished data, it essentially publishes it because it makes it publicly available. But it also lets people maybe somebody's interested in what you studied, and instead of collecting data themselves, they could look at your data that you collected. And maybe there are a few other people that also tried to replicate a study and were unable to. So they could pull all this together and glean some insights as to why a finding wasn't able to be replicated, for instance. Another question is often, why do people do open science? This sounds like so much work. Why would you do it? Well, I think it improves the scientific reproducibility and replicability of the field, and it also builds capacity in the scientific community, especially among trainees. So I first got into open science because I had a colleague who was really into it, and I started to see that the open science community tends to be great. They're great scientists, and they're collaborative and tend to encourage sharing and working together, which is something that I think is awesome. I mean, I think you already have the data, you already have the code. It takes a little bit of extra work, but if you follow a lot of the principles in Repro Rehab that we're sharing, hopefully it won't take too much more work. And as others have said, it not only benefits the community, it also benefits future you when you go back to try to understand your data or blend it with another analysis, etc. And what's involved is usually it's free to download with some agreement that you won't abuse or sell the data. So it tends to be pretty straightforward. My own experiences with open source data and open science have been really wonderful. We, for instance, have shared what we call the Atlas data set, which is a large data set of 1,271 stroke T1 weighted MRIs with high resolution with manually segmented lesion masks. And essentially, this is data that we were already generating for our own research purposes. And then we realized that it could be really useful to the machine learning and computer vision communities. So we made it publicly available. And honestly, it's been one of the most impactful and rewarding, I think, aspects of my scientific career so far, to be able to share data, because it's not only used by people to try to develop better machine learning algorithms for lesion segmentation, which is how we intended it, but it's been used by a ton of students and trainees to learn how to do machine learning or computer vision. It's often used in courses on machine learning. And during the pandemic, it was used by students who weren't able to collect their own data and by faculty and all sorts of people. So to me, it's really rewarding because it takes on a life of its own, and it's able to do so much good that we might not have been able to do on our own. In terms of what types of rehab data are out there, basically all types of data, especially for rehab specific needs. There are surveys, behavioral measures, demographics, kinematic data, video data, physiological data, a lot of brain imaging data. And they can be prospective data collections. So people work together to prospectively decide what they're going to collect, and then they share that data. That's things like the UK Biobank or the Human Connectome Project. There's also retrospective data archives. These tend to be study-specific data sets, like I mentioned before. And this is going to be more common, I think, with the NIH data sharing and management policies. So when people complete studies, they will then share the data, and it will be unique to that study. And then there's also health services, medical records, or observational data sets. So if you're looking for data, some options for especially rehab-related data archives are things like the Center for Large Data Research and Data Sharing and Rehabilitation. This is a great website that has a ton of resources, and you can search it for different types of data. It also has a lot of health services research data sources, and it's very rehab specific. Related to that is the ICPSR and ADDDEP. It stands for the Archive of Data on Disability to Enable Policy and Research. So this is where a lot of retrospective study-specific data sets have been archived. And this is also where we archived Atlas. We actually archived it both with ADDEP as well as with a neuroimaging specific one called 1,000 Functional Connectomes, mostly because we wanted it to be available to both communities, the neuroimaging community and the rehab community. There's also OpenSim, for instance. So they have a free motion simulation toolkit and trained models for different populations. And then more recently, the NIH has released this sharing.nih.gov, which is an amazing website that was referenced in the NIH video. There is a spot on there where you can look for where to share your data by institute. So you could go to NICHD, which is the parent institute of NCMRR. And there are a ton of archives there. It has instructions on how to archive your data, but I think it will also give you an idea of where you could look for data. There are, in terms of prospective or coordinated data sets, there's what I mentioned before, the Human Connectome Project. This has particularly brain imaging data, but also behavioral data. It focuses on lifespan, young adult, clinical populations, older adult, et cetera. It's really a powerful data set. There's also the UK Biobank, which has health records. I think they're working up to 100,000 individuals with brain imaging, genetics, and clinical variables. And then there's the All of Us. So this is US health records data, but also people are going in and collecting additional data. So there's questionnaires, clinical variables, genetics, et cetera. And you can also be a participant in All of Us if you would like to be one of many, many data points. And then there's also community-specific kind of data archives. So like I mentioned, a lot of the impetus for Repro Rehab has come from the brain imaging community, because that's the part of a community that I'm in, and where I've noticed they've done a lot of great work towards reproducibility. And some of the initiatives there include things like Open Neuro, where people can upload their neuroimaging data sets and you can search and download them. And they have really nice metadata that's associated with it. There's also INDI, the International Neuroimaging Data Sharing Initiative, which is where we put our Atlas data. There's also NITRIC, which Dr. Kennedy works really a lot on. And this is essentially, it not only has data, but it also has atlases and a ton of software and tools. Finally, we recently created what we call Repro Rehab DB, or Repro Rehab Database. You can, oops, I just clicked on it on accident. You can kind of think of this, informally, we're trying to make it like a Yelp for data sets and courses. So you can search on Repro Rehab DB for data science courses that we hope will be mostly relevant for rehabilitation researchers. And you can search for rehabilitation-related data sets. I think at the moment we have about 51 data sets listed. Importantly, though, you can also upload your own courses or data sets. So if you are doing a tutorial on something in rehabilitation and it's on YouTube and you want to share it with us, you can upload it into Repro Rehab DB, or you can email it to us and we're happy to do it for you. If you release a new data set or you archive your study data, please let us know so that we can add it to Repro Rehab DB. It is specific for the rehabilitation community, which we hope will make it much more powerful. And then what we hope will be one of the most useful features is that it allows you to rate and review courses and data sets. And you can see other people's ratings, so that hopefully, if you're looking for an Intro to Python course, you can see which of the Intro to Python courses kind of has the best outcomes from other rehab researchers who have used it. I will note it is very beta and in development still. So if you have any bugs, please email us at reprorehab@gmail.com. And I want to give a huge shout out to Coralie Fenord, Sanying Yi, Swapnil Arya, and Paul Bailey for creating it. And especially to Coralie, who took the lead on this very challenging project. And there's a short video that you'll watch right after this video that will introduce you to the interface and kind of show you how it works. So we really hope that this is a great resource for people when they're looking for different types of data or different types of courses that they would like to do. If you need something more specific and you can't find a resource, you may consider reaching out to somebody who's published a data set or a paper using a data set that you would like to utilize. So maybe somebody collected, I don't know, gait kinematic data in people with stroke, with motion sensing and EMG at the same time. And it was during the paradigm that you're really interested in. You could just reach out to them and ask if they would be willing to share that data with you. I think different from the video that Dr. Martone showed, I would have a few recommendations for data kind of requests. In general, especially because the rehab community is pretty small, I think it's nice to be able to collaborate on the data. So not just saying, hey, give me your data, I would like a copy of it. But saying, hey, would you like to collaborate? I have this question that I wanted to ask, or this hypothesis, and I was wondering if I could use your data to test it. And by sharing the data, they could, maybe be co-authors with you. One benefit of that is that you would receive useful insight on the data with regard to how you use it. So all that metadata that may not be written in the paper, when you're talking to somebody about your hypotheses and your needs, they may have insight into, oh, actually, it was collected in this population, or we collected it for this purpose, or here are the quirks of the data, so that you could kind of work together to ask your questions. In addition, no one's data is perfect. Please remember that. I think this is one thing that is really scary for people when we share data. And I think it makes people a little bit hesitant to share data because they think, oh, I don't want people to see, like what's underneath the hood or whatever the analogy is. But nobody's data is perfect. And so I think being gracious about that. And then also, in asking for someone's data, you could also maybe help to organize their data into a data archive that you could also both publish. So we'll talk about publishing your data later, but it could become a win-win for both sides. All right, the next side of this is data sharing. So I want to share data, or as is going to be upcoming, I need to share data. So I think as been mentioned in all of the videos, everyone should think now about sharing your data, and ideally before you even start collecting your data. The NIH's new data management and sharing policy goes into effect in January 2023, which means that all grants that are going in then need a data management and sharing plan, which I think is a great practice for every study, and we should do it whether or not you're submitting a grant. This, again, is the website that gives you details. They also, I think, are going to publish a template for the elements that are required for this type of plan. But there are a lot of great principles that I think are important to consider whenever you start any study, or even if you're in the middle of a study, it's not too late to clean it up. Better to do it in the middle than at the end. Some aspects that are, I think, more specific to sharing rehabilitation data. So human subjects research, for many of us, we're doing human subjects research. So it is important to ensure that your informed consent form and IRB protocol has language for data sharing now. So this at many institutes takes a lot of time. So that's why it's something you can start even before the policy goes into effect. You can ask your IRB about any data archiving policies. At this point, most IRBs have some sort of policy they have online. You do need to make sure that it is in your informed consent form. Some people choose to do an opt-in or opt-out of data sharing on the consent form. So you could say, like, I agree to allow my data to be used, and they can initial, or they can choose not to. Others prefer to do a blanket policy. So if they're not willing for the data to be shared, then they can choose to not participate. And honestly, for us, we tend to go that route only because it is a lot of work to sort your data and make sure that you know kind of who has opted in, who has opted out at the end. And it can be something where, like, if they're not willing for their data to be shared, that is totally fine, and they don't have to participate in the study. So there are some different options and different ways to do it, depending on your unique needs and population, et cetera. And then here, I just put some sample wording for consent and or the protocol. It typically looks something like the researchers intend to keep the de-identified research data indefinitely. The key part is that it's de-identified once you keep it and store it, so that there are no identifiers such as name or other elements. Other researchers may have access to the de-identified data for future research. De-identified data may be included in future repositories or archives or for use by other researchers. So something along this line, I think, is pretty typical. I think your institute may already have suggested language for this, and or the NIH may also share language for this. There are also another consideration are data transfer agreements and licenses for sharing data. So the ideal is to be able to share data under open licenses that anyone can access, such as a Creative Commons Zero license, which is a public-facing license. However, you should also check with your university or institute to see what they allow. Some institutes will require that if you're going to share data, you need a data transfer agreement or a specific license. For some of the imaging data that we've shared, we need to talk to our tech transfer office about sharing it between investigators. For some of it, because it could be identifiable, we have some more stringent data use agreements. So it can't go under a CCO license, but maybe it uses a different license. I really like OpenNeuro's FAQs. It has a lot of discussion about the different license types, and also some other elements of consideration, as well as some suggested wording and language for IRB protocols as well. So there are a lot of resources out there. Here are just a few that you could look into. In the end, always check with your institute because every institute is different. Also, as we mentioned last week and really tried to hammer home, good data management is key. So at this point, you can also ensure you have good data management practices in place. Again, you need systematic machine-readable file naming conventions. So that means no spaces, no special symbols, and consistent naming with consistent capitalization, numbers of digits, etc. Keeping track of your metadata as you go, noting units, abbreviations, etc. One thing that I really like to do is have an outside colleague try to use the data, whether it's a lab mate that's not working on that project or someone else early on in the process, so that if they have any questions, you kind of know what they are and you can ask. So passing data and like having people kind of check and make sure they can use what you're doing, I think is helpful for seeing any implicit assumptions you might have. And then having a system for data analysis and version control is also super useful. So as you're writing your code or whatever, trying to keep up with version control, I know we will have some tutorials, or we'll link to some tutorials on GitHub as one way that you could do version control with your code. Another question that often comes up is what to share and how much to share. I mean, honestly, the more you can share, the better, because all the data that you share ends up being used by different people for different purposes. And like I said, each one takes on a life of its own and helps the scientific community. You could share raw, pre-processed, and/or processed final data. I encourage people to share individual subject data when possible. I really encourage null data and unpublished data, which I mentioned before. You can also publish, of course, your group level data. And then in addition to sharing data, also consider sharing your code or software. So GitHub, as I mentioned, allows you not only to share your code, but it also allows you to collaborate. So people can pull and improve and modify your code, and it's all version controlled. People can also report issues, which I really like, and you can respond to in real time, and other people can see those issues and build on. So it kind of gives life to your code and software. Open Science Framework is another great place to put your protocols and code and data. Sometimes you could put it all in one place. So that's also a great option. And then publishing. So a lot of times, and what's becoming more common, is once you've archived your data, you can also publish a paper about it. One of the benefits of doing this is that it allows one to be cited, which is nice for you, and you get an idea of how it's being used. But it also ensures that you provide the necessary metadata for your data set. So by writing a whole paper about your data set, you have to make sure that you're putting in all of the necessary information on how to access it, how to use it. And then usually during the review process, anything that's not clear will come up as well. Some journals, a lot of journals now have data descriptor formats. Probably the most popular is scientific data. There's also GigaScience, and some of these will also allow you to publish code or share code. There's also data in brief, and there is a great paper by Walters et al. In 2020 that outlines, I think, 13 different journals for sharing data. And then the associated costs. So this is a question that I think might come up, especially after the NIH plan, because you do need to budget for associated costs. In general, this is what I think you may want to consider. There are maybe things that are specific to your data set that you need. But first, you would need someone to scrub or collate the data and generate the metadata in a format for the archive. So again, you should do this from the beginning and use data management principles that we discussed. So this should not be too much work. It does require someone who's familiar with the data. So it's hard to hire an outside person to do this because you really require the ins and outs of knowing what the data is. It always takes longer than you think, even if you have been doing it very carefully. And again, this is why it's great to have someone naive check your data, that they can use it and that they understand what all the columns are, what all the file names are. And doing that early versus later is very helpful. There's often sometimes a cost for the archiving, so you may want to reach out to the archive that you've selected or that you would like to share the data with. This can be free sometimes, it can be thousands of dollars other times. So what you're paying for is essentially someone to go through your data and metadata and reformat it as needed, web storage and web maintenance so that's searchable and persistent, and then facilitating requests and troubleshooting for downloads, among probably many other things that people who host the archives would tell me. And then there's also article publishing fees if you do decide to do a related data paper, which I strongly encourage only because it gives your data more visibility. And again, it is kind of where your metadata can live and it gives a lot more detail. And then the timeline. So in terms of sharing your rehabilitation data, as everyone has mentioned, start early before you start collecting the data. At that stage, when you have a project idea even, you can identify all the necessary requirements from your institute for IRB, consent, data transfer, license, and deciding what you plan to share. So this can be helpful in deciding the file structure and how you want to set things up. Upon completion of data collection, organize your raw data so that it's ready to be shared. And that honestly is probably good practice anyways, because then you can use that formatting for your data analysis. Although if you're doing data management, you won't even need to do this because it'll already be organized. And then after your data analysis, you can organize the analysis pipeline for code sharing as well as the data outputs. Ideally, by the time you write your paper, your data should be ready to go. And in summary, I think open data and open science is a powerful tool and really helpful for overcoming positive publication biases, improving replicability in the field, and training the new generation that's coming up in the field so that they have reliable data sources to use to learn from. Data sharing is now mandated by the NIH. Well, it has always been, I think, but it's becoming a little bit more explicit, which is great. And I think it's just general good practice, both for future you and for others around you. It doesn't have to be painful and hard, especially if you start early. And data often takes a life of its own that contributes to science above and beyond your immediate intentions. So I hope that you will consider all of these things and consider how you could share some of your own data. So thank you so much. And I am happy to receive any questions by email. Okay, thank you.